Good morning, everyone, and thank you for your patience in waiting for our panel to begin. We're very pleased to have two quite distinguished speakers here this morning. If there's ever a time to be talking about the church in the public square in terms of public service, this would be one of those times. Our first speaker is going to be Joseph Sella, who's the former U.S. ambassador to Fiji, Kiribati, Nauru, Tuvalu, and Tonga. Did I get all those correctly?
Correct.
Yes, okay. He served there from 2019 to 2021. He was the Catholic liaison to the 2016 Trump campaign, where he managed the Catholic Advisory Group, and has served in Washington on the House Republican Steering Committee, as well as the Republican Policy Committee. In 2004, he co-founded the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast. If you've never been to that, put that on your Catholic bucket list. It is a great event in response to St. John Paul II's call for a new evangelization. Joe is also the founder of the Pontifex Consulting Group, which, in a nod to its Latin name and his role as former ambassador, seeks to build bridges between individuals and organizations in the corporate space. Ambassador Sella.
Thank you, Mary. Good morning, everyone. It's a delight and an honor to be with you all. I'd like to thank Carter Sneed for his gracious invitation, and thank you specifically to Anthony and Christine DeNicola for their inspired leadership and generosity to make possible the Center for Ethics and Culture, now nearing a quarter century of old, forming hearts, minds, and souls along the way. The center is yet another fruit born of the new evangelization, and its work continues nearly a generation on, and in no more important time than now for our republic. I come to you not as a scholar with advanced degrees, nor as a philosopher, a lawyer, politician, or theologian, but as a husband and a father who is a Catholic, reads a good amount, student of history, consumer of news and cultural trends, and who's been engaged in the public square for over 30 years. I also come to you as a former United States ambassador and always striving to be an ambassador for Christ. I'd like to share a few personal reflections from that perspective. I believe America faces grave challenges both within and without. They are far more serious than climate change or even the state of the recruiting for the 2022 Notre Dame football team. But the solutions lie in our history and the greatest struggle against the Soviet Union and communist ideology in the 20th century, and the decisions we must make in the years ahead to address the new Iron Curtain and its threat to human dignity. 437 miles to the south and west of us 75 years ago, Sir Winston Churchill delivered the Sinews of Peace address at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. As the tentacles of the Soviet Union were beginning to spread and strangle Eastern Europe, Churchill issued a clarion call for the free world to close ranks and fortify themselves against the Soviet communist menace. Churchill aptly framed the moment as these anxious and baffling times, quite like the epochal times we presently find ourselves in. Observing that an Iron Curtain was descending across the European continent, Sir Winston noted, "Nobody knows what Soviet Russia and its Communist International Organization intends to do in the immediate future, or what are the limits, if any, to their expansive and proselytizing tendencies." Churchill cited an awe-inspiring accountability to the future in calling for the West, and America in particular, to leverage what he called its constancy of mind and persistency of purpose to guide the alliance in peace, as in war. This constancy and purpose were grounded in America's founding principles, which were the fruit of broader Western thought and the wisdom of the ages. Those principles were unique not because of what they conveyed to every man, woman, and child, but how they were conveyed by God through man's creation, inherent in every living soul that no man or government can or should deny. Equality, liberty, dignity, the rule of law, private property, freedoms of speech, religion, and assembly. Each of these principles stand in stark contrast to the so-called promise of the people's utopia that unfolded in Russia and then metastasized across Eastern Europe, Central Europe in the mid-20th century. Just a little over 100 years ago, the Marxist-Leninist Bolshevik coup occurred, and over the next 75 years, that ideology sought to diminish the value of life and to destroy the individual conscience of those left to suffer under its rule. The statistics are staggering. 200,000 killed in the reign of terror, the Red Terror, of 1918 to 1922, 700,000 executed during the Great Terror of 1937, 4.5 million dead in gulags, labor camps, and forced resettlement camps. In all, more than 20 million Soviet citizens put to death by the regime. Some say 60 million. As a side note, more recently, historians have estimated that if you total the deaths caused by communist regimes that the Soviet Union created and supported from Eastern Europe, China, Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam, and Cambodia, the victim total is close to 100 million, making communism the greatest tragedy in human history. The late and great Dr. Aleksandras Stromas was a prominent Lithuanian political scientist, dissident author, and one of my professors at Hillsdale College. Living under the boot of the German Nazis and the hammer and sickle of the Soviet communists indelibly shaped Stromas. He later played an integral role in advising dissidents and lawmakers working to shepherd the breakup of the Soviet Union, as well as sharing the authorship of the Lithuanian Constitution adopted in 1992. In an article entitled "To Fight Communism, Why and How," Stromas wrote, "The simple and obvious truth is that with ideologically motivated powers, be it Nazi Germany or Communist Soviet Union, no reliable or long-term compromise or coexistence is ever possible. For these powers will never come to rest until they conquer the world, bringing it to uniformity and concordance with their ideological perceptions, or perish in that process. Tertium non datur, a third choice for them, is not available." It took courage, vigilance, patience, persistence, sacrifice in every way, and visionary leadership from Presidents Truman and Kennedy to Ronald Reagan, Prime Ministers Churchill to Margaret Thatcher, among others, to challenge Soviet communism and to help tens of millions of beleaguered and freedom-yearning people to gain freedom. But no individual played a more significant role than St. John Paul the Great, who lived under and challenged both physically and metaphysically communism's brutality and its fundamentally flawed understanding of man and the dignity of the individual. In June 1979, Pope John Paul landed in Warsaw, went to his knees to kiss the ground of his homeland, and then proceeded to a mass in Victory Square, awash in communist symbolism. There he declared the truth, that man can neither understand who he is, nor what his true dignity is, nor what his vocation is, nor what the final end is, without Christ. In his homily, the pontiff told his fellow Poles, quote, "The exclusion of Christ from the history of man is an act against man. Without Christ, it is impossible to understand the history of Poland, especially the history of the people who have passed or are passing through this land. The history of people. The history of the nation is above all the history of people, and the history of each person unfolds in Jesus Christ. In him, it becomes the history of salvation." End quote. In the words of John Paul II, which could be intended for the people of Hungary or Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, Cuba, or China, salvation took on a dual meaning. The salvation of souls and the salvation of entire nations persecuted and imprisoned. And ideologically, that made every effort to strip people of their fundamental dignity, to deny them truth, and would allow them to see their worth and purpose, was chipped away by the principles of Christian faith, inextricably linked, intertwined with the principles of Western democracy. 10 years later, over the summer and into the winter of 1989, after a tense 45 years of friends and allies standing shoulder to shoulder, the Soviet Union and its East Bloc collapsed. For many on this campus, this is a distant history. But I fear all of us may now have the opportunity to witness firsthand many of the facets of that era today. We in the United States, generally speaking, unlike our forebears, have, with a few exceptions, known only peace, prosperity, abundance, health, and longevity, great conscientiousness of and care for God's creation. We can travel from the top of the world to the bottom of the world in just over one day. And with the advent of the internet, we now have instant access to information and a truly globalized economy and culture. Amazon delivering some things to our door on the same day on occasion. We take much for granted and have grown complacent on the eternal things while failing to see the premonitions of Burke and Santayana that the past repeats itself, playing out on multiple fronts and on multiple levels. I'm speaking of new iron curtains descending. One belongs to the People's Republic of China, which, like its Russian neighbor to the east a century ago, seeks to remake man in an earthly image and likeness, and to subjugate, if not to destroy, whatever and whoever stands in its way. The parallels of the Marxist-Leninist ideological roots and the ambitious and expansionist Soviet Union then and the People's Republic of China now are undeniable. The leaders of the PRC mock, belittle, and angrily deride statesmen or nations as having a quote-unquote Cold War mentality, even the hint of a defense of international law or requests to abide by the letter, if not the spirit, of the Charter of the United Nations. China-centered nationalism zeroes in on establishing itself as the political and economic center of the world at the expense of rules-based order, democratic principles, and morals. Since its founding in 1921, the Chinese Communist Party has killed upwards of 80 million people. And recently, the Ministry of Health of the PRC proudly reported a nauseating and staggering 336 million abortions over the past 40 years as part of its notorious and enforced family planning policy. One difference between our 20th century thugs and our 2.0 version is economics. Whereas the Soviet Union offered little value to the West in trade, the PRC, which claims to desire only, quote, mutual respect and peaceful cooperation and offer its capacity for manufacturing, innovation, and market power and profits. But to participate, countries and corporations must accept the mirage that fronts the reality, the truth, if you will, of human slavery, political and religious persecution, IP theft, and anti-competitive business and trade policies. In China, this is called the Hyde and Bide, rooted in the Chinese proverb which translates to hide your brightness, bide your time. Following the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre and the justified global outrage, Deng Xiaoping established his 24-character strategy, which is to, quote, observe calmly, secure our position, cope with affairs calmly, hide our capacities, and bide our time, be good at maintaining a low profile, and never claim leadership. Some say that era is now over and the era of hide and bite has begun. We see this in China's expansionist Belt and Road Initiative, which seeks to calmly and with a low profile take control of other countries' natural resources and properties. We see it in its military provocations, its treatment of its own ethnic minorities, and its refusal to cooperate with the global community it claims to be a part of in understanding this infernal plague that has beset us. And as with the Soviet Union, where religion and the laity, priests and religious were targeted, arrested, disappeared, assaulted, or killed, their churches and religious statues destroyed, we see it happening in the PRC. The most recent being last month's arrest of 58-year-old Catholic Bishop Xiao Zhumin in Wenzhou. He has been arrested previously, twice in 2017 and once in 2018, and detained for months. In these instances, religious leaders are detained and then subjected to various forms of indoctrination, even torture, uniquely ahead of significant feast days in the church, as a means of preventing Catholics from gathering. And of course, perhaps the most palpable example lies in Hong Kong, a region with wealth and civil liberties that many around the world complacently believed was too visible and successful for PRC's leaders to want to destroy it. Over the past several years, as my time as a diplomat in the South Pacific, there was much discussion and observation of the PRC's ambitions and actions with countries like Australia and New Zealand more geographically proximate and ready to engage, comparatively to the United States, more remotely, with such focus and outrage rarely found or heard. More often we hear such comments regarding China as it's a different culture and they're too important for our country to risk a new Cold War. Or who are we to America to judge, given our own history? And this brings me to my concerns regarding the threats here at home, where a less obvious iron curtain is being forged. Here, an increasingly militant, intransigent, and even violent culture seeks to exclude free speech and expression, if not simple truth, from the public square, and to set us on a perilous path that threatens the dignity of our fellow Americans and the Republic itself. Russia had its Red Terror, China had its Cultural Revolution. Here in America, we are not so grand in our branding. Ours is humbly and less ominously known as cancel culture. Some say woke, but it deserves a far darker title. In today's white-hot media and social media reactionary environment, it is virtually impossible to raise issues in the arena, let alone have an even-handed debate without being derided, smeared, tagged, labeled, maligned, denigrated, and silenced. Some call these social and political clashes soft and make light of them. But anyone who observed the riots in Oregon, Minnesota, Michigan, Washington, D.C., Chicago, and other parts of the country last year, or who has experienced the intolerance of thought in the academy or in corporate America, or spent a half hour on Twitter, understand that those engaging in canceling, or woking, I guess, do not see their effort as anything less than the rewriting of America's history and the undercutting of our national purpose and certainly the dignity of the individual. It should not be lost on us that for decades, both the Soviet Union and to a lesser degree, the People's Republic of China have sought to use America's openness, diversity, and unique position in the world against us. Just as back in the 1950s, the Soviet Union even launched significant propaganda campaigns against the Catholic Church in attempts to dispirit the faithful behind the Iron Curtain, to, in short, to lose faith in one institution that gave them hope. I believe the purpose of today's propaganda and misinformation, fake news, and all the canceling tools of the culture wars is no less evil than the people of faith for centuries have combated spiritually. Where one evil seeks to divide man from God, the other seeks to divide us socially and politically. Ultimately and fundamentally, the goal is to undercut the meaning and message of the eternal truths and principles that guide the West for centuries, inspired our nation's founding, and girded us to defeat communism and totalitarianism in the 20th century. Why? Because a democracy without truth and a respect for human dignity is nothing less than a totalitarian state. Unfortunately, our people and culture seem willing to play their part to achieve this end. And I might add that the PRC is laughing all the way. At last week's Congress of Catholics in Public Life in Madrid, Spain, Archbishop Jose Gomez of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles compared today's American divisions to those created by Marxists and such heresies of the church as Gnosticism and Pelagianism. There's certainly a case to be made that we are seeing new secular, self-centered religions around our environment, technologies, the human body, and beyond. Most are embraced or encouraged by our political, legal, and corporate elites, some in academia. Many, if not all, are based on the primacy of a personal truth or one's own truth or simply the truth. Here, too, we find Soviet and Chinese communist parallels. In both cultures, the concept of truth, if not its definition, was fungible and used to the advantage of the state against those who sought to speak truth, real truth, to power. As St. John Paul did in Warsaw in 1979, as those in Tiananmen Square did a decade later in Peking. And those two images of courage in defense of truth, I would close with what I hope brings a bit of light into what I know has been somewhat of a dark presentation. While the weather outside, we know, is indicating winter is upon us. You may see that this weekend. I do sense a spring emerging in our society's pursuit to reassert the primacy of not one's truth, but the truth. Met many of the students here last night, a couple of them, Luke and Mary and others. The publication known as The Lamp, it was very uplifting. Holy Spirit's at work. Here at this center and at this university dedicated to our Blessed Mother and erected in the pursuit and defense of facts and truth, this environment is being nurtured. Your efforts are important not just for those participating in these programs and studying in these halls, but for the years ahead when they emerge from here and participate as lawyers, doctors, policymakers, teachers, mothers, fathers, priests, religious, and the lay consecrated. Here in institutions like this is where we must fight for truth and strengthen across our country the accountability that preserves our republic for future generations. We must be hopeful, always. But as with early spring buds, we must be cognizant of the fragility of our freedoms and be prepared to defend them. As America's timeless principles inspire generations both here and abroad, so too our Catholic faith's eternal truths can guide us and inspire us. It is imperative that we as a society reassert the primacy of civil, fact-based discussions and the truth. To do otherwise would be to accommodate those who seek to destroy the truth and the meaning and dignity of man. And history has shown that happens to those who seek or support such accommodations. Thank you for your time, and God bless.
Thank you, I think, Ambassador Sella, for, you must be fun at a cocktail party. Look, whoa, it's that guy again. No, but that was, in all seriousness, very sobering remarks, and important for all of us to keep that sort of information before us. You referenced, Ambassador, anxious and baffling times, which I think is going to be my takeaway from your talk, because I am truly baffled by the political world in which we live, and so I'm so grateful that Congressman Dan Lopinski is here with us to shed a little bit of light on what it must have been like to be a pro-life Democrat in a very, very pro-abortion party. If Congressman Lopinski looks nervous, that's because he went to junior prom with my sister, and I may or may not happen to have that picture on my cell phone, and have threatened to put it up on the screen at any kind of random time if he gets boring or something. So, so I just wanted to put that out there. Yeah, he's, and he knows I'm serious. That's the funny part. For those who have not followed the congressman's career, so he went to the best Catholic high school in Chicago, which is St. Ignatius, and there's no dispute over that.
Only in Chicago?
Pardon me? Only in Oh, the world. Yeah, probably. Yeah, I should not have limited that. And went from there. He was much smarter than I was, so he went on to Northwestern and then to Stanford for his engineering degrees, and then to Duke University for his PhD in political science. So during the, how many times? 16 years on the Hill? 16 years in Congress, representing Illinois' 3rd District, which is a fairly heavily Catholic sort of mix of white collar and blue collar people, but I would say a good 50% Catholic in the district, in the way, people still refer to where they're from by their parish, that sort of thing. And that's a real thing in Chicago. People really do still. I had a Jewish friend, in fact, who figured out what parish he lived in just so he could, like, when he was at the barber, he could, because he said it wasn't worth the conversation. No one knew what. But he was on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, as well as the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And if you talk about things that make a real difference in people's lives, if you've ever sat at a train crossing in Chicago and you have an appointment and you're sitting there for 15 minutes, you understand why things like the Transportation Committee are really important, because train transportation, when we rely on it so much, and if you've these shipping delays that we're having now, these really impact, the trickle-down effect on Americans are very real. So it was good to have someone with Dan's skill and knowledge and smarts on those committees. But he's probably best known for being the co-chair of the bipartisan Congressional Pro-Life Caucus. I think many of you know that in 2 years ago, or I guess it's 3 years ago now, the pro-abortion groups kind of band together, and they decided even one pro-life Democrat in Congress was one too many. And in Illinois, the pro-abortion lobbying forces have so much money. I'll just give you one tiny example. Illinois just repealed its Parental Notification of Abortion Act. At the same time, Planned Parenthood built 3 new clinics at the Missouri, Wisconsin, and Indiana borders with Illinois. And in fact, a classmate of ours from St. Ignatius sadly voted for that bill, but I was told by a very good inside source that individual legislators were offered $300,000 each for their next campaign if they would vote for that bill. So all Dan had to do to keep his seat was to say, I'll throw a pro-abortion vote or two your way. That was all he would have to do to keep his seat, but he wouldn't. And, there are people you hear about who live their lives with this kind of integrity, and Dan knew it could likely cause him his seat, and it did. And that was the one issue. There was no other issue at play. It was the abortion issue, and Dan, in my opinion, very heroically, along with Judy, his wife, who doesn't take credit, but she is the force behind him, to live out his Catholic faith in a way even when it cost him. And the things that were said about him publicly and some of the horrific ads that were run against him, I was saying to Judy, I don't know how you do it. I'd be out with a don't tell, well, this isn't being taped, is it? I was going to say I'd be out with a rifle somewhere if that was someone talking about my husband. Uh-oh. I mean, I would be praying for them with my rosary. But at any rate, that's my weapon, is my rosary. So at any rate, he very courageously stood for the church in a way that I just don't think we see very much from our current president on downwards. People who are willing to cause scandal by sacrificing their Catholic beliefs for either money or a position or for both. And so I think we're all very honored to hear from Congressman Lopinski today and to be able to engage with him on, frankly, what gives a politician that kind of courage to stand up to the face of the evil that the ambassador was talking about. So thank you for letting me go a couple minutes longer on my introduction, but 2 minutes wouldn't have done that justice. So Dan Lopinski.
Well, thank you very much, Mary, for that introduction. I want to thank all of you for being here. It's great to see a packed room, and we had a great presentation by Ambassador Sella, and I'm waiting for the first person to ask the ambassador about what it was like to be in Fiji and all those other places that he had the honor of representing our country there. And there's so many things from what Mary was saying and from what the ambassador was saying that makes me want to leap into other issues. But if I did that, we would be here all day. And so I'll try to stick to my my written remarks here. But before we start, let me say one thing, because talking about how dark everything is that the ambassador Joe was talking about. It's November 12th. Just 3 days ago, is November 9th. That was the 32nd anniversary of the Berlin Wall coming down. I never thought I would see that happen. I was actually living in Switzerland at the time, and I went, just 5 days later, I went up and spent 4 days in Berlin. And it was incredible to see, because the two sides were still so different, but the wall was open, and watching the East Berliners come over to the West in experiencing something that they had many of them never experienced before. But to me, it also showed, one, it was the evil empire, but something happened we never expected. We didn't expect it to end. And I know a lot of you are very young in here. Please learn about this. We cannot forget the lessons here, that we need to stand up, and the great work, the political work that was done, but the spiritual work, and especially the leadership of St. John Paul II. And it made a huge difference. So that's always something that we have to maintain hope in everything that we're dealing with. And I'm going to talk today about the divide in our country today and what the Catholic answer should be. I was recently, last week I was in Washington, I was talking to a former colleague of mine, a Republican member of Congress, and he was telling me that he used to refer to himself as an evangelical Christian, but he recently started to refer to himself as a non-denominational Protestant. And the reason he did this was that too many evangelicals now believe that their faith needs to serve their politics. He said there are evangelicals who think Trump is Jesus. And this is tearing apart evangelical churches, undermining their roles as Christian witnesses, and adding to the crisis of the divide in our country. Now, I'm somewhat familiar with what he described, though I'm not a part of it. I'm not in the middle of it. So it wasn't a complete surprise to me. But what he said next really did surprise me. He said his hope for an answer to our nation's divide lies in the Catholic Church. Now, this is a Protestant. His hope lies in the Catholic Church. And this is a conclusion that I came to many years ago. And that's what I tried to do to live my life as a Catholic with God's grace and serve in the U.S. Congress as a Democratic member, but a Catholic first. Now, polls show that people are very concerned, Americans are very concerned about the divide in our country. But why does it seem so dangerous? I mean, we've had these same two political parties for about 160 years, and they battling each other in election after election, Democrats, Republicans. But today there's something that's different. There's been an elemental change in the nature of partisanship for many Americans. It's now rooted in many people's social identity. Research published in 2019 in the American Journal of Political Science showed that partisan political/social identity, it's really mixed. It's really melded into one right now. This identity is so powerful that for some people, it not only can determine or change their policy preferences, but also their self-identified religion, class, or sexual orientation. So today, Americans, as you all know, are presented with, by our culture, with a binary choice of two possible identities to choose from, each with a set of beliefs on a wide variety of issues or topics, from tax policy to the nature of human persons. Though most people only focus on a number of concrete issues. Americans are given the message that they must choose one of these two, Democrat or Republican, left or right. And once they make their choice, they must conform themselves to every belief or risk banishment as a heretic. But it's not love or even warm feeling for one's own group that holds these two parties together. It's contempt for those on the other side. So what we have is not tribalism, as a lot of people talk about tribalism. It's sectarianism, which is a moralized identification with established beliefs, where members on each side view those on the other with contempt. It's partisanship as a fundamentalist pseudo-religion with a strong sense of maintaining purity in in-group, out-group distinctions. And it views politics as a zero-sum game focused on the next election. An increasing number of Americans are embracing sectarian partisanship. Though not everyone, I want to be clear, not everyone who affiliates with a party is a sectarian. But sectarian partisanship infiltrates all aspects of American life, even signs in front of homes, and it adds tension and bitterness to everyday life and eliminates real discussion and debate from the public square. Now, I was a political scientist before I ran for Congress. Don't hold that against me. Man, you may not have the same feeling that I do. I would not vote for most political scientists for political office, let me just say that. Really smart people, but I was always much more of a pragmatic, practical person. I wasn't in political philosophy. I didn't study political philosophy, so I'm getting out of my league when I talk about philosophy. But our country, what I do know is our country was designed in our Constitution. Our government was designed in our Constitution in order to force the federal government. The institutions were designed to force deliberation and compromise, because James Madison thought that these were necessary to maintain freedom and democracy while keeping a very diverse country together. If the federal government did not function in this manner, Madison believed America risked not merely lawmaking that served only special interests, but two extreme consequences: the loss of our republic to tyrannical rule and the collapse of the nation because the government was viewed as illegitimate. But for sectarian partisans, deliberation and compromise are unacceptable, since the other side is contemptible and must be defeated. Because of this, we're beginning to see the sprouting of the results that Madison feared. This policy divide between the parties on many issues makes policymaking very difficult, but sectarian partisanship makes policymaking virtually impossible. The process on even seemingly non-ideological issues such as transportation policy is viewed as a zero-sum identity-based competition in which winning and not forging the best possible policies is the primary goal. The ensuing congressional gridlock leaves a power vacuum filled by presidents who act beyond their constitutional power, as well as an activist court and unelected administrative state. Sectarian partisanship has also led to questions from both sides about the legitimacy of elections, lawmaking, and the actions of elected officials. These have been used on both sides for misuse and abuse of institutional power inside of government, which happened both by and against President Trump, and have inspired mob activities on the outside, whether we're talking about the rioting in our cities in 2020 or what happened January 6th at the U.S. Capitol. If we do not find a way to restore the public square and reform government institutions so that people on both sides are willing to work with each other through debate, argumentation, and compromise, the republic created under our Constitution cannot survive. But to know how to deal with this, we need to probe a little bit deeper. Earlier this year, a Gallup poll found that 40% of Americans said they belong to a church, synagogue, or mosque. 47%, down from 70% in 1999. All right, if you're in college, that seems like a really long time, but it's not long. 22 years. With this dramatic decrease in the number of Americans who claim a religious home, there are many more people who are looking for meaning, for a mission elsewhere. They find this meaning by making a political party their religion, turning party ideology into dogma. They very easily get hooked on one of the two sides because they provide a sense of belonging and meaning, as well as a strict set of beliefs about the correct policies to support, societal rules to support, and leaders to uncritically follow. Most importantly, they provide an other to hold in contempt and to judge oneself superior to. Now, it's tempting to think this decline in religious affiliation, actually this was membership, affiliation a little bit different, but that's gone down significantly. But it's tempting to think it's only on one side. But the decline was 25% among Democrats, 18% among independents, and 12% among Republicans. Among self-described liberals, the drop was 21%, amongst moderates, 21%, and conservatives, 14%. While the decline is certainly greater on the left, it is also significant on the right. And I'd argue that it is on both sides that many Americans are substituting a political party for their religion. But this leads to, I know, an issue that you're already thinking about it as I talk about it. There is something different going on the left. On the sectarian left, we have a rejection of organized religion, especially Christianity, and a rejection about biblical assumptions about the human person that have been a critical foundation of America since the beginning. Though somewhat muted, you can hear echoes of the French Revolution. In 1989, Roger Scruton wrote Man's Second Disobedience, Reflections on the French Revolution. In this essay, which is about the French Revolution, but also about communism in the 20th century, Scruton says the revolution was a war against religion, an attempt to recreate the world as a world uncreated. At its core, the French Revolution was not a reaction against abuses of power, but it was a rejection of worship of a transcendent God of Christianity. In doing so, the sacredness of the human person, humans as imago Dei, was rejected, leading to the treatment of people as property. Additionally, the sacredness of human associations was rejected so as to clear the way for control by one false association, the party. With no God-given basis for human dignity, life could be discarded for the public good, and the public good was defined by the party of the revolutionaries. Scruton says the dogma of revolutionaries was not a system of belief, but unbelief. It demanded amorphous, unattainable ideals whose purpose was simply to delegitimize rival powers. If we look at what is going on in our country today, the terms equity, anti-racism set up such ideals and serve as cudgels to tear down institutions, organizations, and individuals. Scruton also discusses the French revolutionaries' claims that only they had access to the mind of the people, whose protesting members thereby merely betrayed their collective identity and ceased effectively to exist. Think today about what happens to women who are pro-life. They're considered traitors of their sex. Or just listen to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who I recently had the pleasure of hearing speak here. Many of you maybe did. Clarence Thomas is considered by many a traitor to his race. Finally, consider Scruton's claim that the revolutionaries' advocacy of education conceals another and vaster design, to lay hold of the infant soul and mold it according to his own requirements. I'm sure for many of you, this brings to mind all the controversies going on in our schools today. So, as we see these parallels between revolutionaries in France in the late 18th century and the sectarian left of today, including similar manifestations of their ideologies, we can recognize the sectarian left presents a significant break from biblical understanding of human dignity that has served as the foundation of our country. I'm not saying that we are definitely heading in the direction of late 18th century France, but we see the danger. So as faithful Catholics, should we drop our concern about the divide and respond by joining the sectarian right in a no-holds-barred fight in the public square? Should this be our choice? But before I answer that, I want to go back to Scruton's essay. Scruton defines politics as a process which has the conciliation of rival interests as its meaning and its goal. He believes that politics is indispensable and sharply criticizes revolutionaries for, quote, negating the process of politics through contempt for compromise and demonization of opponents. He says they infect all public processes with the sense that they are without justification and are merely the passing drift of power. They're illegitimate. Scruton concludes it follows that opposition cannot be met. It is not the object of negotiation. It can be the beneficiary of no agreement. Opposition is to be destroyed. Once this conclusion is reached, any action in pursuit of victory, no matter how destructive of law or institutions, is justified. This is where partisan sectarians on both sides are going. It's not just the left, but we see this on the right. So if we want our republic to survive, and if we really want to stand up for human dignity, we need a different answer than just saying we need to throw in with the sectarian right. As a faithful Catholic frustrated with the sectarian left and the direction of our policy and culture in our country, I know it's really tempting to look for this quick solution. And this has led some to embrace political messianism and muddle temporal political aims with Christian identity. As my former colleague in the House spoke about in the evangelical churches, we see the same in our Catholic Church. We should not confuse partisanship with membership in the body of Christ. And political victory should not be seen as divine imperatives in the mission of an authentic Christian life. It's not going to work, and it's a danger to our country and to our church. So, what is the Catholic answer? We all need to have the courage to enter the public square and be Catholic first. Now, this does not mean that everyone has to get into politics, be a politician. But if we want to live in a country where human dignity is protected, we all have an obligation to do our part. St. Thomas More, who was a patron of politicians and statesmen, and also lawyers, I'm not one of those. St. Thomas More really taught us a lot about being Catholic in a public square. He formed his conscience through prayer, the sacraments, and lifelong learning. He also exercised humility, something all too rare in our world today, which enabled him to retain his moral integrity and follow his conscience. For 16 years, with God's grace, I tried, however imperfectly, to play my part as a Catholic in Congress. After first being elected in 2004, I went to Congress as a Democrat from Chicago, knowing I'd face challenges within my party on some non-negotiable issues. But I forthrightly proclaimed my position on these issues and said that I would not change. This caused consternation among the sectarian partisans of my party, who viewed me with suspicion and saw my refusal to always follow the party line as betrayal. I was committed to being Catholic first before I was a Democrat, and people recognized that. I had more than one constituent come up to me, many times, sometimes positively, sometimes not, and say, and I just remember one person who was like a revelation to him, came up to me and said, "You vote Catholic." Now think about that statement. Now it says something about me, but it also says something about the Catholic Church. Can you imagine someone going up to a representative and saying, "You vote Presbyterian or some other particular religious faith"? The Catholic Church offers many gifts that we too often take for granted. One of these is the rich tradition regarding the pursuit of the common good, Catholic social teaching. This means that we have guidelines for what it means to put Christ's teachings into action, and we cannot just pick and choose which we like. The 7 themes of Catholic social teaching generally do not directly tell us what specific policies to support or oppose, but tell us we need to be discerning the best policies for the poor and vulnerable, for workers, for God's creation. One theme has a clear line to particular policy: life and the dignity of the human person, arising from Imago Dei. This is non-negotiable, and policies that directly flow from this are non-negotiable. But my Catholic faith also guided me to be committed to the conciliation of rival interests. My rejection of sectarian partisanship provided me with the respect of colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and that helped me bring representatives together from both sides to work on issues where there's room for compromise. Yes, the sectarian left has a different understanding of what justice means, but there are many issues that Congress deals with, or should deal with, where that should not matter. Dialogue and deliberation are not going to result in a legislative solution to every problem, and they're not going to bridge the divide when basic values are fundamentally different. But they can make the political process much more functional than it is now. And let me say again, dialogue and deliberation are not selling out. They are not surrender. We can still hold to our principles. But if you know one thing about me, if you knew nothing about me, you learned this from Mary. So I won't go through the whole story, but I wound up being the pro-life Democrat, at least the pro-life Democratic leader in the U.S. House. I never intended this to happen. I always knew I was going to be pro-life, but I didn't intend to be the leader. It really happened with the Affordable Care Act. And I was sort of thrust into that role, and I knew that I had to take up that mantle. Things really changed in 2016. I think with the election of Donald Trump, both sides really went in a direction what I would call a sectarian partisanship. After having no primary opponent in 2014 and 16, the pro-abortion groups all came in, along with the Human Rights Campaign. Chicago Teachers Union spent more than $3 million against me, flooded the streets with campaign workers, and I barely won in 2018. I didn't back down. I still spoke at the March for Life. I still did everything in the House. Maybe I doubled down on being pro-life. And they came down even more on me in 2020. As I was outspent by more than 2-1. 5 presidential candidates stepped in to endorse my opponent. I'd become a political leper in my party. And a couple days before COVID shut down everything, I narrowly lost the 2020 primary. But I was proud to choose to be Catholic first. I have no regrets about that. As the legendary Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, said, "A jackass can kick down a barn, but it takes a carpenter to build one." Right now, those who act as sectarian partisans are doing a real good job of being jackasses. We can all be that way at times, and there are many things going on in the world that deserve condemnation. But what we need is to be carpenters. We build by sharing a vision of human possibility that's far greater than the hopeless one this world offers. Yesterday in his homily, Bishop Rhodes talked about the importance of witness if we want a world that understands and respects human dignity. St. Thomas More was martyred almost 500 years ago. He was the ultimate loser in the eyes of the world. But almost 100 years ago, in 1929, G.K. Chesterton said that Thomas More is important today, but he is not as important now as he will be 100 years from today. Here we are, almost 100 years from then, and Chesterton was right. Being a witness often means suffering what appears to the world to be defeat, but it's the most powerful thing that we can do. We need to get out there. If we want a world, if we want a country that respects human dignity, we need to get into the public square. We need to be out there. We need to bring God's message. We need to bring Jesus into the public square. And we can do this by putting our Catholic faith above partisanship, above personal comfort, and above fears. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Lopinski. I'm glad that you referenced Thomas More, because I've often thought, with Dan's, particularly this last loss of Thomas More's line, I died the king's good servant, but God's first. And so his putting God first cost him a seat, but, it's not as if it would have cost him his soul. So, of course, I think he has followed very much, although they're of different parties, of another great pro-life statesman from Illinois, which is Henry Hyde, for whom the Hyde Amendment is named. And district next to yours, Dan? He was,
Yeah,
one of-
pretty
yeah,
much.
yeah, pretty much, yeah. Illinois is very gerrymandered in terms of, I know that's going to come as a shock to people. In Illinois, no, what are you saying? But, one of his comments when he was asked about his public pro-life stand, and he talked about the day that we're all going to face judgment. And at least, because someone had said to him, you pro-lifers, you're not, Roe is still legal, Casey didn't overturn it, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know why you people stay in the fight. And he said, we're all going to stand before God one day. And when we do, those of us who worked in the pro-life movement will have millions of advocates whose voices were never heard in this world, but they're heard in the next. And hopefully they will ask God for mercy for all of us. So at any rate, so I didn't want to get too emotional there, but it's this really is sort of where the rubber hits the road with the faith. And our willingness to speak about pro-life publicly can, that can get you kicked off Twitter these days, but which is a cesspool on the best of days, right? So, but with all the things you can say on Twitter, defending the unborn, often gets you a warning. So as I learned the hard way. So at any rate, we have about 15, 20 minutes for questions. I think we can stay a few minutes past the break, if that's okay with the ambassador and the congressman. Okay, terrific. And yes, please, if you wouldn't mind standing so that we can hear you clearly. Thank you.
Hi, question for Mr. Lopinski. Thank you so much for that. I'm wondering about concretely trying to engage in the public square. Your party shut you out, mercilessly shut out those like you. The other crowd, say, were the party of parents, but every time a parental leave or child allowance bill comes out, they vote it down, If I was to join a party, I'd be afraid that if I joined the Democrats, that give it 10 years, I'd be like, well, abortion's not that important that we should consider. If I joined the Republicans,
Yeah, I've seen that happen.
if I joined the Republicans, I'd be afraid of saying, if I care a little bit, if I care about racial equality, or if I think that there should be a child allowance, I'm a communist.
Yeah.
How do you do it concretely? If Catholics get into the public square, how do we do that in a way that actually lets us keep our own souls in the way that you have?
Well, that's probably the toughest question, and it's something that I dealt with when I was in politics, and I deal with people. People ask me that all the time, and there is no simple solution or easy answer, because I want to encourage, especially young people, to be involved need to be involved. We need good people to be involved in government and in politics. And yeah, it is so hard, but there are people on both sides, although I have to admit I have more hope in the Republican Party these days in terms of being more of fully embracing Catholic beliefs and principles, Catholic social teaching. But you just have the courage to get out there. It is hard, and I can't tell you. I'm not going to tell you it's going to be easy, but you just got to do it. And we need people who are willing to do it, because that's the only way things change. I mean, we've seen things go downhill, but we also know the power of witness. And let me just tell you, I never thought that I hate talking about myself. That's
why I'm here.
It was one of my weaknesses as a politician. But I didn't think I thought I'm just doing my job. What else am I going to do? I was pro-life in 2020, but I was pro-life my entire life, and I was never going to change. I never thought anything. I never thought it was courageous to stand in the same place. I always say I'm just stubborn. But I mean, we have to, as I said with St. Thomas More, how he maintained his moral integrity. And if you are good, in terms of if you are talented, and I'm thinking about St. Thomas More, I mean, he reached the highest level possible in government, but in England at the time, without losing his moral conscience. You just got to do it. You got to try it. You got to get in there, and but you need especially, I'll say the last thing, you need a community around you that is going to be supportive. And that was incredibly important to me also. And I think that you can find that. So I know it's not an answer, it's not the solution, but that's what I would encourage you to do. And we can change, and the parties do change. They can change, they do change, and they need to change. And it only does it if good people are willing to get in there and do it.
Well, and then just a follow-up point to that, I remember a conversation that we had, and just about how, being a member of Congress or a member of the Senate is sort of like a celebrity, sort of position in some cases right now. I think we saw that with, AOC showing up with her ball gown with the Eat the Rich, and and I remember, Congressman saying to me at one point, these are what people don't understand. Being a member of Congress, if you're doing the job, is hard work. Like marking up a transportation bill, I remember I was waiting for him to call me back for something till 2 a.m. is hard work, and it's boring and it's tedious, but it has to be done. And if you're doing the job right, you do your job. And so I think, rather than outsourcing things like that to staff, to put, not only have the courage to go into public life, but to be good at what you do and to do the work, and not to try just to be a celebrity, but actually to bring your gifts and your skills, whether you're an engineer or a lawyer or a member of the medical profession, bring those gifts with you. So that's how you make a change and make a difference in legislation. So I don't know, it seems to me just the last couple of election cycles, this kind of like politician as celebrity culture has grown too.
I don't want to go down. There's more questions, and I could ramble on for a long time.
All right.
Yes,
Okay.
there are people who run for Congress now who have no interest in being a legislator. That's a big
Well,
problem.
that's a very good, that sums it up. Yes, sir.
Thanks very much for your talk. I particularly thanks for encouraging people to get involved in public square, because that sounds very important and really encouragement, I think. I just thought that maybe a criticism that might be running through the minds of the audience would be this idea that if the other side doesn't play by the rules, why should we? It's this idea that if we play nice, we'll be taken advantage of. And I think it's interesting. I mean, I come from Australia, and there, unfortunately, we don't have a pro-life party at all. Both parties are not reliably pro-life. One's perhaps a bit better than the other. And so the thought might be that we'd end up in a worse position if we were to play by the rules in that way. So I'm just wondering kind of what you'd say in response to that. I'm deeply sympathetic to what you've said, but just thought I'd put that to you.
Well, I know that has been a response as well. If we don't go in no holds barred, then we're just going to lose. I looked at it and said, if we're all going to go down the drain, I don't want to be a part of that. I mean, essentially, yeah, I understand that, and there's things, you make compromises along the way, but you cannot. It's so hard being in politics, and that's why people get sucked in people wind up doing things in being people that they never expected to be. But you cannot. You have to have lines that you're not going to cross, and even if you're gonna lose, you have to remember in the end that you are a witness, and that's more important. And so I'm not saying just. You give up, you give in to everything, you work hard, and maybe you have to work harder. But I understand that criticism, and people, I hear that all the time. People say that all the time. And again, these are great questions, but it has to do with having the courage, because no one wants to lose. No one wants to lose, and if we always lose, we completely cede we cede the policy-making arena if we're really going to do that. But I think we are at a point where we could lose our country. We could lose our republic. Let me say that. I think we could lose our republic. And so we can't just play games and go along, because I think that this is a time to stand up and stand strong.
What's Ambassador Sella's take on that question?
Yeah, you have an answer? I hope you have an answer.
I guess it plays to your first question, gentleman from Ireland, ahead of the gentleman from Australia. But there's a great article that I'll commend to you by George Weigel in a February '98 edition of First Things. It said 1989 was made possible by a prior moral and cultural revolution, which created the conditions for the possibility of the nonviolent political upheaval that swept Marxism, Leninism into the dustbin of European history. So really, and the article's titled John Paul and the Priority of Culture. I mean, if you don't start there, I think what's going on here and all of you and what you're doing, how you're engaged, mentioned a couple of your great colleagues last night and their work. I mean, the joy de vivre that I've experienced here the last day is stirring,
Yeah,
very
it
uplifting,
is.
consoling, and so I think that Secretary Pompeo coined a phrase. I think he was engaging with the Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin, about having a permanent opposition to tyrannical regimes and ideology. So I think the left, has had a unique, comprehensive engagement that I would say center-right people do not have. I think it's a voraciousness, it's a pervasiveness. So whether you're called to the political arena, again, the courage and the truth at the fore, but we have to pervade, whether it's elections, and they can be tedious. I've done it for 30 years. Dan's done it longer than I, but the legislative, the legal, the church, media, and some of this I've seen going on just with testimonials of students. So I think courageously, boldly pursue and proclaim the truth. I mean, John Paul the Great spoke of preach the gospel in ways that are new in methods, ardor, and expression. That's our call, that's our charge. And I say it's alive here doing what you're doing, the fact that you're here and all you are here. Great hope, charge on, and we can talk more after some ideas, yeah. But.
Mr. Meyer.
Yeah, both of your presentations were absolutely terrific. I've got a question for the ambassador, though. In 2016 and 2020, I mean, in my family, we were faced with two really bad candidates from our perspective. And so we had to go through the process of, okay, now what's the right road to take? And we ended up voting for Trump both times, by the way. But how did you, ambassador, come to the conclusion that that was the lesser of two evils? Or how, when you're in that kind of a circumstance, maybe the audience could use your views on how you go through the calculus of coming to a final decision on that.
It's a great question, a difficult one. I would say in 2016, I did not, I took some heat, as you probably know and remember, of signing on to a letter in opposition to then candidate Trump. Voted accordingly in the primary. As the campaign advanced, things began to crystallize. I don't know how to say it. He settled into his stride. I think began speaking to the everyday concerns of everyday people. My in-laws are from very rural Michigan, to the suburbs of Detroit, friends in union halls and so forth, but tapped into, I guess, a deep, broad, fast-moving river of discontent, whether it's economics, taxation, regulation, life, our exceptionalism as the United States. And considering the likely opponent who repeatedly and aggressively and along with her colleagues attacked the Catholic Church, mocked her and her teachings, that was key. In about June, I knew he was likely going to win. I don't know how to say it other than that, and wanted at least to, and you never know in politics, but wanted to have an impact. And as for 20, the same rationale was weighed. And I think we'll see what happens in the next couple of election cycles. Unfortunately, with friends in 16 and 18 cycles, had forecast sort of a 1968 dynamic where we did see for the first time in 2016 blood spilled. Horrifying. I mean, small scale, but and it's up, and God forbid it escalates further. But I think that the importance of what you do here as students, what Carter does, what Dan does in his new vocation, we're all in this, and start with the culture. So, but we cannot leave any realm of the front of the war uncovered.
Okay. All right. Yes, there.
One thing that I have been told is that times of crisis make for saints. And I'd say that with the times being anxious and baffling, it's definitely a time of crisis. And we obviously have John Paul II and quite a few saints from the 20th century, but are there any people that you see as peers that inspire you to be better Catholics? Or are there people that have practices that encourage you to strengthen yourself spiritually in your profession?
You wanna go
No,
first?
You can
no,
both answer.
Okay.
I don't have an answer.
So Dan Lopinski, for one. St. Dan of Chicago. But
Talk to my wife.
I would say there are so many unheralded people that you'll never know or meet. Somewhere in our midst, right here, I hold up Fran Mayer as one of them. Richard Dorflinger, who have been in the arena, Kishar Jabalon, quiet warriors, but impactful at these front lines. And impact. And models to turn to.
Right.
I would say Jimmy Lai, who's a friend sitting in a prison cell in Hong Kong now. We presented him the Christi Fidelis Laity Award at the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast in September for his courage. I guess fast forwarding to now, you may have followed the Hong Kong protest. There was this iconic photo of a fellow holding a Captain America shield. And his nickname became Captain America 2.0. And so he is 31 years old. His name is Ma Chun Man, and was just sent to prison yesterday for 6 years because of that. Again, I would take to heart these words he wrote in a letter to the judge, courageously signing it Captain America 2.0. I do not feel any regret. On my road to democracy and freedom, I can't afford to be a coward. So, and meanwhile, all of us, perhaps of varying degrees, are Marvel Comics fans and moviegoers. I know my children certainly are, but you contrast that, a non-U.S. citizen, Hong Konger, fighting for freedom, fighting for his life. Superman, can you finish his previous charge of truth, justice, and the...
American way.
And what is it now? It's truth, justice, and?
The American way.
No.
No. What now? What?
It's truth, justice, and a better tomorrow.
Oh.
So, again,
Thud. Okay, it's. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Dan.
No, I don't. I don't need to add anyone else there. I am someone who is. I'm inspired by people like the ambassador mentioned. But I just because of who I am, and I am not a hero worshiper. I really look to people who are doing things on an everyday basis. teachers at Catholic schools who I think are doing exceptional roles, people who work at crisis pregnancy centers. And I tell you, let me tell you this, and this is a good place to mention this, being here at Notre Dame. When I spent a year here as a visiting assistant professor, and it meant, my office was down by the grotto. And it meant a lot to me to see students there in the evening when I'd come back to my office sometimes in the evening to work and see students praying at the grotto. And it actually meant so much to me because I remember what it was like to be in college, and the fact that these students, I'm seeing their faith there, and it wasn't just before finals. But every evening I would see students who were down there, and that really helped strengthen my faith to see that. You don't know we never know what kind of witness and how we are strengthening other people, no matter who we are. We don't know that, and that's, I will never forget that. I'll never forget how these students are down here praying. This is it. Seeing that meant a lot to me and helped to strengthen my faith. And so don't ever forget that in everything that you do. When we're talking about building the culture and building the faith.
I just want to just make one note for housekeeping purposes. It's now 10:20. The next sessions will begin at 10:45. So if you're willing to stay for another few minutes, it seems like there's quite a few more questions. But if anyone needed to leave, this is technically the end of the session. But yes, right there. Yes, you.
Congressman Lopinski, you were my representative for most of my life.
Where'd you live?
What parish?
Where do you live?
Western Spirit.
Okay.
Where is you from?
And as a current registered lobbyist for Catholic bishops and state legislators, you're a huge service and inspiration to me and many of my colleagues. But my question is about China for both of you. We've seen both administrations talk a big game about the Uyghur Muslims and genocide, but we haven't taken in a Uyghur refugee in several years. And we're going to go to China in a few months and celebrate the Olympics. So what is it going to take for Western democracies and Eastern countries to form a strong alliance against China's terror activities?
I'll let the ambassador go first. He'll be more
Diplomatic.
Something. Excellent and timely question. I would say very important. The national defense strategy that President Trump ushered through was decidedly, I guess I would say, a bold step forward to doing that exact thing that you speak of. You have AUKUS now. You have Australia and the UK and the US in its own group. You have the Quad. And it is, I think, trajecting where it needs to be. I would say it's a poverty that more assertiveness and clear-spokenness isn't happening, whether it's from the Uyghurs in terms of elevating our refugee numbers to accommodate those. I would say holding our corporate entities to account. I think that unfortunately took a step back recently in making a bill that's either about to pass or just passed. So I do think that, as I said earlier, I think Xi Jinping, who in fact today, breaking news, in the 6th plenary session of the Communist Party was the third of their leaders. Mao Deng in 1945, I believe in 1981, was declared a historical figure. So again, I think that cult of personality is cementing. I think they're decidedly moving forward. You hear of, again, their Navy is soon to eclipse ours in terms of raw numbers. That you get into some details there. I think we're at an advantage in many ways, and they're doing target practice on U.S. aircraft carriers out in the desert. So I think we cannot lose sight. So I hope and pray that Secretary Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, keep President Biden on that trajectory, and not to be eclipsed by, and this is, I think, a real concern. Obviously, we have to be stewards of God's creation, but I don't think he can be eclipsed by asserting that climate change is the national security strategy, threat too. It's just not, it's not real. So.
Very quickly, I think we should boycott the Olympics to show China, but also to show all the corporations who have invested so much in it that we are not going to kowtow to them either. We as a country need to have the courage. We need to have a politician, it's so hard to do. I mean, we need to have a president who says, we're going to have to give up something as Americans because China's a real threat. But when's the last time we had a political leader, tell us we need to sacrifice for anything? But we need to sacrifice. If we are going to stand up to China, we're going to have to sacrifice. We're not going to have all the cheap goods that we get from their cheap, oftentimes slave labor. I mean, it's not going to happen, and we have to tell Nike, Nike, the NBA. I mean, it's just disgusting. I mean, it really is. In history, it is. Hopefully, it's written by good people. History is going to not be kind to what is being done right now because we see what's happening in China, and no one wants to respond because it's going to be painful. It's going to.
Yes, sir, all the way in the back.
Yeah. As we talk about reaching the culture and the divide there, I think recently in China, there's been 4 different regional governments that have banned anyone under the age of 18, under adult age in China, of attending church, even the state-sponsored church, as a further attempt at indoctrination and secularization of the youth. As we look at some of the parallels that you've laid out, how do you think that we can effectively reach youth here in our own country, not just within either the Catholic or the Protestant tradition, but as a whole, actively engaging them civilly in the civil process as well?
I think I just met you a few weeks ago. I think your name is Joe, and you are the president of the Student Statesmanship Institute
A loaded question, I know.
in Michigan. So again, another shining example of engaging the youth, their hearts and minds and souls with the biblical tradition of the Western thought, Judeo-Christian principles. So I mean, keeping on what you're doing, I don't think it can be overstated the importance of opening up this dimension of their role in the arena, as we've talked earlier. But I would bring the past to the fore and make the parallels I think that Dan and I spoke of to let them know the stakes. And I think you look at our brothers and sisters on the left, I would say in many ways they are again, they are we need to be tenacious as they are. It's certainly a time for catch up. The good thing is that truth is on our side and it's timeless. One final thing that I'll just add on to Dan's final question is that, in 1980, many of you may or may not know that we did boycott the Olympics, Winter Olympics in Moscow. So there is precedent of that. So great point. And yeah, so I think that.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Mr. Sella, Mr. Lopinski, thank you so much for your compelling and inspiring words, especially in encouraging the youth to be courageous, right, and to fight for the truth, even though that is something that is we're forced to give up. What do you have to say about, first of all, the need to engage in the political sphere, but also the need to have a sort of contemplative life on top of that, right, to retreat to. We mentioned the struggle to try to fight in the same way that they do. If they break the rules, why should we abide by them? And we need to have that sort of contemplative space, right, as you mentioned here, the grotto is a great example, for us to retreat and celebrate, especially embodied by this conference, celebrate and contemplate the values that we have What do you have to say for creating that sort of space in our daily lives so that we can still engage with the integrity that we need?
Well, I feel like I'm offering advice on spiritual practices, and I'm not quite qualified to do that. Well, let me just say, I think it's. We know what we're taught by the church, and what I was talking about St. Thomas More is prayer in the sacraments. I think so many people have discovered how incredible Eucharistic adoration is. It is so hard because of these devices. It is so hard to take time away and have. I mean, I know how hard it is for me, and I grew up without it, and you didn't. So you have to get away from these constant interruptions and take that time, but also find other people. One of the best book, probably the best book I think I've read, maybe in the last 10 years, was the Benedict Option, Roger. It's not saying retreat from the world. It is saying we need our communities to help keep each other strong and keep the faith strong. And I think that's incredibly important. And you got to do that. No place like Notre Dame to be able to do that. But once you leave here, let me just say, when you leave, and I hate starting to give advice. But when you leave college, it's a really hard time. It's a really tough time. And it's a time where I think the church is failing to reach people, to reach young people. And so you need to really make the effort when you leave college, if you're going, no matter where you're going, to keep with your practices and find your communities, because it's easy to lose, it's easy to get lost. And one last thing I want to say, and I think it's very important, because it's easy to look at people and say that they're lost, and I keep talking about a sectarian left and what their lack of beliefs, and they want to cut down. They don't share the biblical view of the human person and what they get caught up in. I think it's important that we don't just write them off. That's what we keep seeing this in the world, however, the deplorables, or whatever you want to call people, writing them off. People are yearning for something greater. And then I was trying to say that in my talk is they need to be offered that, and we're the ones who need to offer that to them. And don't forget that, and don't give up in that, and don't think, well, just write them off. I think that's that's also crucial in all this.
Okay. I'm sorry. The next group is waiting, and we have to clear the room. So I'm sorry to have to end things here. But thank you so much. We could go on.